Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you this morning. As Gordon just prayed, we've got a beautiful Lord's Day morning, and we are blessed to be able to be together. We are studying in the book of Hebrews, and I was just looking online on our YouTube channel. We've had 20 lessons so far, and we're just at the end of chapter 11. So we're taking about 2 weeks per chapter, I guess, on average. But that's okay because there's a lot of really great information in the book of Hebrews. We're right at the end of chapter 11, and thanks to Monty for filling in for me last week while I was gone. And I think he's pretty much wrapped up the discussion of chapter 11. We know chapter 11 so well, we call it Faith's Hall of Fame. It talks about great characters of faith through Old Testament time period. And boy, they're just, what they did is amazing. The faith that they demonstrated is so incredible. And as we pointed out over and over again, you read down there, by faith, here's what this person did. By faith, here's what this person did. By faith, Noah prepared an ark, By faith, Abraham left his homeland. And just over and over again, it talks about these people of faith and then describes what they did in faith. And so it's really a great study demonstrating the fact that if we have faith, then it will be demonstrated in the things that we do. Do you remember in our gospel meeting, Stephen Russell preached about biblical faith and how biblical faith should be understood the way first century people would have understood the notion of faith. It is the idea of devotion, commitment, loyalty. So if you have loyalty to God, then what would a loyal person do to the one who has authority and commands? God has authority over our lives. He commands us. A loyal person will do what he's told to do. And that's what all of these great heroes of faith in the book of Hebrews chapter 11 did. All right, now, I just want to look at the last couple of verses in chapter 11 before we move on to chapter 12. Notice, well, we might mention 38 as well. All of all these characters, of whom the world was not worthy, they wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And so that's sort of the world was not worthy of these people. They were such great people. But notice verse 39, these all having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. The idea of that is, through that whole time period, they were looking forward to a promise that hadn't been fulfilled yet. Now, we think back to the threefold promise to Abraham. His seed would be a great nation, they would possess a land. Those two parts of the promise had already been accomplished. But the third promise, through thy seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed, that hadn't happened yet. And so throughout all of the Old Testament time period, they were looking for something they had not received yet, that promise. But God has provided us. So the Hebrew writer speaking to those first century Christians who now have been the recipients of the promised seed and the blessings that would come through the promised seed. God provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. In other words, if this hadn't happened and we now the beneficiaries of this seed promise, if that hadn't happened, notice they would not have been made perfect. In other words, all that they had done had been in vain, would have been good for nothing, if this that we now realize hadn't come to pass. And so it's kind of neat how God's plan brought us all together. We needed them, and they need us in the sense that they need this time in which the seed promise has been fulfilled. So I think that makes what they did even more amazing, that they kept on keeping on, even though they hadn't received the full fulfillment of God's promises. They were still waiting. But the Hebrew writer is saying to his audience, we've got that now. Something better has been provided for us. And again, so now, once more, repeating the theme of the book of Hebrews, is the Hebrew writer is saying to those first century Jews who had converted to Christianity but were tempted to go back into Judaism, he's saying, no, that doesn't make sense. We are now at a point in time when the full fulfillment of God's promises has been achieved. You are the beneficiaries of that. And he wants them to notice, you've got something better. He even says, he's provided a better thing for us. You are in a better situation than even Noah and Abraham and Moses and all the others that are mentioned in chapter 11. You, he says, are in a better position than they were. Well, that would also include us. Right here we are nearly 2,000 years later, but that's still descriptive of us. You know, in a sense, almost it seems unfair. I'm thinking of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel. And I'm thinking of Noah and Abraham and Moses and Joshua. And I've got something better than they had. We're in such a privileged position, it just almost seems unfair. Here's these great heroes of the faith in the Old Testament times, and we've got it better than they had it. Obviously, we think that they will also be rewarded eternally. I'm not saying that, but in our lives right now, right here, right now, we are in a better spot than all of those great heroes of faith in the Old Testament times, and that's amazing. That's pretty incredible when you stop thinking about it. Gordon?
We don't have no excuse to complain, compared to those here in the Hall of Fame. They kind of like a cheering section. They're there. We did it. We did this. I mean, and what little things that we have to do, we can make it.
Yeah. When you read what Monty was teaching last week about up there. When it says, for instance, verse 36, a trial of cruel mocking, scourging, bonds and imprisonment, stones, sawn asunder. We haven't had any of that. We haven't suffered that. Yet they were willing to endure that. And if they were willing to endure that, what should be our response to God's blessing? So, again, Hebrews chapter 11, just so powerful, and great lessons in it all. But, Tom.
The last also drives home at the same point that the writer of Hebrews has been pushing all along. Why do you want to go back to something that is inferior to what you have?
Yeah.
And he makes that in that closing statement there in chapter 11. It's sort of subtle the way that he does it, but he's saying there's, like you said before, what they did was nothing until it was provided through to who he's writing to right now. And, it ties all that together right there in chapter 11.
I think you're right. Alex?
What do you think when it says in verse 40, God had provided something better? What is that something better specifically? A better faith or what?
I think it's a better, go back to the idea of the better covenant that he mentioned in chapter 8. We are under a better dispensation because of what God has brought to fulfillment through Christ Jesus. And so, their covenant was not. It was inferior. It says God found fault with it in chapter 8. And he replaced, but a second one took its place, a better covenant. So I would argue God's whole way of dealing with us is better than the way he dealt with them through this covenant. Wayne?
These are just types and shadows of everything that they lived under. And like Tom was saying, why would you want to go back under that old system when the whole scheme of redemption, as it's being given in shadowy form here, is coming to its fruition through us? Yeah. And their lives would be utterly pointless were it not for God's plan being fulfilled in us.
Exactly.
And that, I think, is his main emphasis.
I think you're right. Well said. Karen?
We have to really be careful that we appreciate this. I mean, when you think about everything that they went through, we need to be careful. take our lives for granted since we have not been sawn in two, we have not gone through what they've gone through.
I think you're exactly right. But I think that's the great danger, that we just sort of, oh yeah, we're Christians, we go to church on Sunday, we really underestimate the situation we're in. I think you're right. Alex?
Kind of tag on to that, when you think about the parable of the talents, the more you have received, the more you are expected to return.
That's a good point. So since we're the recipient of greater blessings, wouldn't you think that that would obligate us to do better things for God? I'm telling you, some of those guys that are in chapter 11, it'd be hard to outdo them in regards to their faithful service. But your point is well taken, that to whom much is given, much is expected. All right, that's us, and we need to be aware. Good point. Other thoughts? Okay, so let's dive into chapter 12. And Wade and I were talking about this just before class started. Sometimes we talk about bad chapter breaks, a bad break, and this is sort of a bad one. I mean, I understand you got to break them somewhere. And so in a way, this is sort of a good break because he stops talking about the historical figures, but he's going to make application of it in these next verses. So, it's probably a fruitless endeavor to quibble about chapter breaks. But clearly, chapter 12, verse 1 is drawing a conclusion from chapter 11, right? So let's read chapter 12 of Hebrews, verse 1. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him that endured such contradictions of sinners against himself, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds. Ye have not yet resisted unto blood, striving against sin. Okay, so whenever we read that word wherefore or therefore as this chapter begins, we understand a conclusion is being drawn, right? And so the conclusion is there's this great cloud of witnesses. And it's kind of interesting to think we're compassed about, or we're surrounded by this cloud of witnesses. So Noah and Abraham and Moses, and Elijah and Jeremiah, and Ezekiel and Daniel, and Joshua, and all these great heroes of the faith are sort of like a cloud that surrounds us. And we have their testimony. We have their example. We have all that they did set forth for us, recorded in the divine record. And when we think about all that they did and endured, and that they testify to us of God's grace and mercy and faithfulness, what should be our reaction to that? Then we ought to lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and run with patience the race set before us. So, I'm thinking about Moses. What should Moses' example cause me to do? It should cause me to lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and run with patience the race that is set before me. I mean, that's just logical, isn't it? I don't think that takes any stretch to understand the point he's making. If they did it, we can do it. If they did it, we should do it, is the idea of what he's saying. What do you think? Let me ask you a question about lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us. Certainly we want to lay aside the sin which easily besets us. If my particular sin is telling lies, I ought to put that away. I ought to lay aside the sin. It's just so easy for me to tell a lie, or it's just so easy for me to cuss. What do you do when you have a sin that will lay that sin aside? But what about the weight? Is that just redundancy, or is there a difference between the weight and the sin which does so easily beset us? Monty?
Sometimes there's things that we get involved in our life that are not sinful, but they hinder us from being obedient to God or faithfully serving God. And so while they're within themselves are not sinful, I mean, it's not sinful for me to have a bass boat. But it would be sinful if I let say, well, I've got this nice bass boat. It's a shame just let it set out in the garage. I need to be taking it fishing. So if I'm doing that so much because I've got to justify having the thing to the extent that it causes me not to be studying like I ought to be, or not to be attending worship like I ought to be, not to be serving others like I ought to be, then that bass boat has become a weight around me, and I need to get rid of it. And whatever might be our thing that is that weight for us that hinders us from completely and faithfully dedicating our life to God, then we need to get rid of it.
I like that. I think that's exactly right. So there are some things that weight us down that may not in and of themselves be sinful, but they keep us from, and what do they keep us from doing? From running the race that is set before us. And I don't think that the connection of those two things is accidental in that verse. If you're running a race, okay, so you're going to run a 5-mile race, right? Now, I got this 60-pound backpack, and would you like to, you can if you want to, you can carry this 60-pound backpack while you run the 5-mile race if you want to. If you were running a 5-mile race, would you opt to take on this 60-pound backpack? I think not. You'd say, are you crazy? I'm not carrying all that weight when I got this race to run. I'm taking that backpack off. Well, there are things in our lives that are like that. We're trying to run the race, serving the Lord. We're trying to run this Christian race. It doesn't make sense to carry around a lot of weights that make it harder for us to do the job. And so like Monty was illustrating, he's got this boat. It's a beautiful day outside. There's a great temptation to go to the lake and fish instead of worshiping God. If I can't deal with that, if that is hindering me, I need to get rid of the boat because that's weighting me down and challenging my faithfulness. So it asks us to be honest, right? We're going to have to be honest with ourselves. Okay, are you honest enough to say, that's a problem in my life, and I need to lay that aside so that I can run the race more efficiently, right? Wait.
The way this version says, so then let us rid ourselves of everything that gets in the way, and the sin which holds on to us so tightly, and let us run with determination the race that lies before us.
So it uses the expression, everything that gets in our way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like it. Tom?
In the past, I guess, I don't know if it's still on or not, there was a show called Biggest Loser. You had these, obese people that came together and tried to lose weight, and they voted in. But the conclusion was, one of the episodes toward the end of it was they had this backpack filled with the weight that they'd lost, and they had to drag it up this hill. They weren't told what was in it until they got up to the top of the hill. And then they tell them, oh, you just drove up the hill the 78 pounds that you lost. Now, throw it over. Yeah. And, the concept was, now go on. You've lost that weight. You don't need to be carrying it with you anymore. Yeah. Get rid of it. And
so in the physical sense, we would understand that, right?
Yeah.
And so we got to be smart enough in the spiritual sense to realize that we're dragging around a lot of extra weight. We're just making it harder on ourselves. I think that's right. James?
I think a lot of times it's not the running the race. If running the race is important, it's finishing the race, right? So a lot of times we get things out of our lives that stop us from running at all. But it's the little things that add weight here and there and there. And ultimately, that's what will stop you from. Maybe you're going to start the race and go for quite a bit, and you'll stop running it. So it's those little things like Ronnie was saying. If us being Christian, we don't invite those large weights anymore in our lives. Just leave the small things that really will get us and stop us.
I think that's a good point. So this backpack filled with this extra weight, it's not one big extra weight. It's typically a whole bunch of little stuff that adds up. And so we got to be perceptive and diligent enough to rid ourselves, just continually ridding ourselves of the little things that weighed us down. I think that's a good point. Sarah?
They made that point in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 about taking a life. Yeah. And he said, I say this for your benefit,
With as few distractions as possible. Was that what verse you were going to, Alex? Oh, okay. Hey, go ahead.
I thought she was going where I was going.
Okay, go.
There's another passage that talks about running a race and how we're supposed to be striving for the prize.
Yeah.
And if you think about the Olympics and what they do, you know, you see the athletic runner, the Olympic runners, and they shed every ounce that is possible to shed because they're pushing as hard as they can, trying to give themselves every possible advantage to win the prize.
Yeah. You would not, for instance, if you're running an Olympic race, you wouldn't wear steel-toed work boots, you know.
You wouldn't even wear normal tennis shoes.
That's right. Those shoes they wear are so you can't. They're feather light, so they can run more effectively. Exactly right. Anybody else? All right. So that's a great verse, isn't it? That really talks to us about how we should view what we're doing here. And again, I think we have to be honest. So if the thing that's weighting me down is my job, for instance, maybe my job has got me so weighted down that I'm really not being able to be a very effective Christian, then I need to think about changing that. You know, I think we have some things that we hold sort of in sacrosanct position here. Oh, well, that's my job. I couldn't give up my job or whatever, you know. No, whatever the weight is, and if it happens to be my job, if my job is keeping me from being able to be efficient as a Christian and running the race effectively, I need to even think about giving up that job. You know, that's a much harder thing, you know. But I mean, it's a lot harder to give up my job than it is to give up my fishing boat. You know, I really don't want to give up my fishing boat, but I could maybe contemplate doing that. Are you serious? You would think that this might even mean giving up my job? Yeah. If that's the weight that's keeping us from running the race like we should, then even that. Roger.
Jesus talked about we might have to give up members of our family.
Even family relationships potentially. I think you're exactly right. Okay, Tina.
Sometimes we want to make excuses, you know, for things like that. Well, God understands, or God knows, or God expects me to work, or whatever. But I think also these people that we read about before, they take in every excuse that we could possibly come out with away in what they were asked to do, and by faith they did it.
Yeah, good point. So, you think it's asking too much to give up your job? Tell that to Moses, who gave up the pleasures of sin in Egypt as the grandson of the king. He gave that up. So you think it's too much us to ask for you to give up whatever? Make your case to Moses. That doesn't work, does it? It just doesn't work. Okay. All right, good points. Wade?
I was thinking about that song that we've been singing here lately, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. And the verse is, turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full into his wonderful face, and let the things of earth go strangely dim, or something like that. It seems like it's just exactly from this.
Well, and that's exactly what he's going to go on to talk about Jesus here. Let's look at verse 2, looking unto Jesus. And Wade mentions that we've got a song that we've been singing recently, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. And the Hebrew writer is saying, do that. So I think that what he's saying, he's given a whole bunch of examples of various great characters of faith. But the ultimate one, without question, is Jesus himself, right? And so he mentions Jesus, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds. So you want the perfect and ultimate case study. Look to Jesus. He's the author and finisher of it. So he designed it and he brought it to fulfillment. He finished. He brought it to he brought the whole thing to fruition, fulfillment. For the joy that was set before. What was the joy that was set before Jesus? I mean, He had it made before he even descended to earth, before he ever came from heaven. I mean, he was in heaven, by the way. So why would he do this? Why would he endure all that he did for the joy that was set before him? He endured the cross. What was the joy that was set before him, Monty?
As I was thinking about that, I thought it was joyful to him to fulfill God's will. It was joyful for him to accomplish our salvation, because that was what God wanted. And so when I think about it, that's the attitude we ought to have. If we're doing what God's will is, we shouldn't be going down kicking and screaming, well, I'm going to church Sunday morning, but I don't want to. Jesus didn't come here like that. Jesus said the Father asked him to accomplish a task, and it was joyful for him to do what the Father asked. So our attitude ought to be, we're going to obey God with joy, not with grudgingly because it's something I got to do but I don't want to, but because God asked me to do it. That should bring joy in my life, the completing of his will rather than our own.
I think you're right. And so in the broadest sense, Jesus took joyful satisfaction in doing the will of God. But I think, as Monty mentioned it, certainly significantly here, the joy that was set before him that caused him to endure the suffering of the cross was the joy of bringing God's plan to fulfillment, and that many could be saved in the process. Wayne?
The passage that really helps bolster that point that you're making is Isaiah 53:10. It says, "For the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief." Well, why was God pleased to crush Jesus? Of course, it's about Jesus. And the answer is, if he would render himself as a guilt offering.
Yeah, exactly.
God looked forward to the plan, to the fulfillment of the plan that Jesus was implementing. And he was pleased at the fact that he would be the guilt offering for sin.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is the point that he's making here. The pleasure that Jesus looks toward is not the dying aspect of it, but it's what that death bought, and it bought us.
Exactly right. Tom?
When you think back, when the night he was betrayed and before he was tried, and, the human side of Jesus really starts to come out. He's there, he's praying, he's stresses like, the sweat's like blood. He knew what was coming, but how does he, complete it? He says, "Thy will be done." And that's the concept that he was. That human side of him was gnawing at him that says, hey,
It's going to be awful.
It's going to be awful.
Yeah.
I don't really want to go, if it's possible for me not to go through it, but whatever happens, it's your will.
Yeah.
He was willing to do it even under that extreme temptation and distress.
Yeah, I think you're right. Notice, he endured the cross. That's got to be one of the biggest understatements that could possibly be made. I mean, he endured the cross, oh yeah. Well, you think about the real meaning of that and the horrible, torturous agony. We remember it every Lord's Day when we take the Lord's Supper, but we need to really focus and concentrate on just how horrendous. I mean, actually, I think our minds cannot conceive the torture of it all. It's beyond our comprehension. When it says he endured the cross, that really understates the totality of it. He endured the cross, despising the shame. It wasn't only the physical torture of dying on the cross, which was just indescribable, but there was a shame attached to that. People who died on crosses, they weren't the elites of the world. They weren't the sophisticated, philosophical, superior people. The people who died on the cross were the very lowest of society. They were despicable. You hang a guy on a cross, he's a despicable criminal. He's a horrible, terrible, awful person. He deserves what he gets. There was a shame associated with being killed in that way. It wasn't just the torture of the death, but the shame of being so treated. Here, think about this. Here's Jesus, the very Son of God and creator, co-creator of the entire universe, co-creator of these people who are killing him, torturously. And he endures that. He despises to be treated in that way, but he endures that. He despised the shame, but he endured the cross, and now is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. He made it. He finished the course. He saw it through, and that's really the point, isn't it? All through chapter 11, and now about all those chapter 11 examples, now the ultimate example of Jesus himself. He was faithful. He finished his job and sat down at the right hand of God. Consider him, Jesus, that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds. That's amazing when you think about it in verse 3, the contradiction of sinners against himself. He had to endure that. Here are these people who are spitting in his face and slapping him with their hands. They taunted him. They humiliated him. He endured it. They lied about him so that they could condemn him to death. And he didn't even make a defense. He could have. When they, remember it says they buffeted him and then they challenged him, tell us who it is that smote thee. And the reality of that is Jesus, I can tell you who you are. I can tell you your whole family history. I know right where you live. I know everything about your life. He could have done that. He didn't. And then when they brought forth false witnesses to lie about him so they could condemn him to death, he could have easily proven that they were lying, that they weren't telling the truth. He didn't. The prophecy was, as a lamb or a sheep dumb before shears, so opened he not his mouth. Peter says that when he was reviled, he reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to the one who judges righteously. Through it all, what the Hebrew writer is describing there in fairly brief fashion, we know it to be true. He despised what was happening, but he endured it. It was such a contradiction. Here are these horrible sinners who are accusing Jesus of sinning. Here are these horrible sinners who are violating the will of God, who are condemning Jesus who's fulfilling the will of God. That's a great contradiction. He endured that contradiction of sinners against himself. And so the Hebrew writer's conclusion is, consider him, lest ye be weary and faint in your minds. Ye have not yet resisted unto blood, striving against sin. If Jesus could do that, surely you can do what you're called upon to do. You haven't bled yet for the cause, right? Well, that would certainly apply to us. We haven't even been seriously persecuted for the cause of Christ. If all of these heroes of faith, especially thinking of Jesus, could endure all that they endured to fulfill the will of God, surely we can. Wait.
So the NASB says, he endured the cross, despising the shame. The NIV says, scorning the shame. And then this version says, he accepted the shame as if it were nothing because of the joy that was put before him, God put before him. What do you think that means?
I don't know. I don't know if that's, what translation is that one?
Oh, that's a New Century Version.
I don't know if that's a fair translation. He did consider the shame as something. It said I think the idea that this was an awful thing. The shame associated with being treated in this way was a horrible thing, and he hated that it was so, but he endured it. So I would argue that's a better understanding of the expression there, that there really was a shame associated with it, and he knew so, and he despised it, but he endured it anyway. I think that's to me, that makes better sense.
Greg, I think it's kind of a comparison. Comparing joy to what he thought. He thought of it more or less. He didn't put as much weight on these.
Okay, so in that sense, what Wade was saying, it was nothing in comparison. Okay. Okay, I get that. I think that makes sense. Alex?
I have a different thought if someone wants to continue.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say there's a lot of passages in the New Testament unjustly. And then you also have Philippians 2 talking about his humble mindset. And here, the point is that he had hope. He wasn't focused on right then that the pain that was right then and there. He was looking forward. He was looking toward that joy in the future. He had hope, and that enabled him to persevere through it all. And one of the points here is that we need to do the same thing so that we don't grow weary, so we can have perseverance. So, when we're in the midst of strife and struggles, we don't look at the strife and struggles in this life. We look at the joy ahead of us in heaven, and we say, I can keep going.
That's a good point. Well said. Good point. All right. And again, boy, it stings a little bit, doesn't it, when verse 4 says, "Ye have not resisted unto blood, striving against sin." What price have you? You haven't paid the price that Jesus paid, not even close. You haven't paid the price that those great Old Testament heroes paid. So, don't offer the excuse it's too hard. Don't offer the excuse that you just can't make it. You can make it. You just got to keep on keeping on, right? Tina.
Not to sound negative on him, but it's kind of sad that he paid that price for us. And all he asked is, love me, keep my commandments are not burdensome. And yet how many people, you might say, that claim to be Christians is like, really? We have to be baptized? You mean we have to go to church every Sunday and worship? We have to take the Lord's Supper every Sunday? I mean, that's the things that's going through their mind.
Yeah.
That is just so nothing.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't even deserve to be on the same page, does it? What we're asked to do and what Jesus and these others did. You're exactly right. All right, let's take on the next paragraph or section of verses here, which I think are a little harder to understand, but I think we can make it. Really all through chapter 11 and these first 4 verses of chapter 12, I think are just very plain and easy to comprehend and apply. This is a little tougher. Verse 5, "And ye have forgotten the exhortation which speaketh unto you as unto children. My son, despise not thou the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of him. For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. If ye endure chastening, God dealeth with you as with sons. For what son is he whom the Father chasteneth not? But if ye be without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, then are ye bastards and not sons. Furthermore, we have had fathers of our flesh which corrected us, and we gave them reverence. Shall we not much rather be in subjection unto the Father of spirits and live? For they verily for a few days chastened us after their own pleasure, but he for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby." All right, so this has to do, the King James Version I'm reading here talks about chastening or chastisement. We would probably, and newer versions likely do, use more so the word of disciplining, to be disciplined. He first, in verses 5 and 6, references, I think very closely, a statement from Proverbs chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. "Despise not the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of him. For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourges every son whom he receiveth." So, God disciplines like a father disciplines, and he's going to make that parallel here. If you had a father that never disciplined his child, then you would say that father doesn't care. That father's not a loving father. That father's not doing what's in the best interest of the son if he never disciplines him. And so we are the sons of God, and that being the case, we understand that there are times when we must be disciplined or chastened, as the King James says. In fact, if that never happens, if you never suffer any chastisement, then that would be the equivalent of not even being a son of God. Our physical fathers, he said in verse 9, gave us correction, and we honored our physical fathers. Why wouldn't we also do the same for God? Our fathers, our physical fathers, disciplined us after their own pleasure, but God disciplines us for our own good. Now that, he says in verse 11, that disciplining in the moment that it's happening does not seem to be very much fun, but it brings forth a good result, peaceful fruits of righteousness. Note, as parents and children, the instances of discipline are never fun. It's not fun for the child, but it's not fun for the parent either. It's just not, we would rather not have that, but we know that in doing that, as parents, we know that going through the unpleasant thing of disciplining our children helps them, they'll be better off. Their lives will be enriched because we were diligent enough to do our job of discipline. And that it will bear good fruit if we discipline them as we should. All right, I think we see the picture. Now my question to you is what is this discipline or chastening of God? God chastens every son that he loveth. What is the chastening or discipline? Any thoughts on that? Wade?
Well, whatever it is, he repeats this in an admonition to the church in Laodicea in Revelation 3. In verse 19 it says, "Those whom I love I reprove and discipline, be zealous therefore and repent."
Okay.
So it seems that it's not just individually. It looks to me like he's doing it to churches, local churches.
Okay, all right. What would you think? Give me an example or an illustration of what you think this chastening or discipline might be, Monty.
Because in another place it says, all who live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. And these people apparently were being persecuted, going through difficult times, because they were trying to live Christian lives, and even to the point they was considering going back to Judaism because they wasn't persecuted then. And so it may be he's saying some of this persecution is a test for you, it's a trial, it's a chastening for you in order to get you to live better, maybe even to appreciate the joys of heaven better, because we've got it great here on this earth all the time and never any difficulties. Why would we go to heaven? We got it good here. And so along those lines, that could possibly be what he's talking about here.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think it connects with what we've just been talking about. The faithful people of God throughout all time have had to suffer through hardships in order to demonstrate their faithfulness to God. Jesus himself suffered through unspeakable hardship in order to do the will of God. And so God allows that to happen because it perfects us. He allows us to have to deal with the hardships of the Christian life because that perfects us. So here's my son, and all I ever do to him is give him a big bowl of candy and say, "Eat all you want." That doesn't make him a good person, does it? I mean, I'm not helping him by just giving him everything. But when he makes a mistake and I correct him, or when I make him deal with harder things, then I perfect him to become a mature person. And that's what I think this is saying. We're out of time. I don't think we've got to the whole heart of that matter. Think about that between now and, Lord willing, next week we'll wrap up the thoughts about God chastening those that he loves. Thanks, everybody, for your good comments this morning.